Hi guys, my name's Mikkel. I'll be talking about the basics of British parliamentary debating. Some of this might apply to other debate formats, but I'm primarily talking about British parliamentary because there are a lot of things that might be specific to BP that are very important that people know from the onset. So the structure of this lecture is going to be as follows. I think the first thing that I'm going to talk about is why you should debate or why you should do BP in specific. Then I'm going to go on to the main body, which is basic introduction to the rules, the format of BP debate, and how the arguments work, how positions work, all that sort of stuff. And then I'll sort of go on to some random thoughts that might be useful to people who are starting out in debate, but also a lot of people who have been debating for a while. Yeah. So the first thing is, why should you debate? So there are a couple of things. I think the first and most obvious one is it improves your communication skills. So, I mean, some of you might find it useful. And in fact, it is useful academically that you're able to present calmly in front of a crowd in a cohesive way. Second, it improves your logical reasoning, or at least allows you to develop it in ways that perhaps other interests won't do in the same way. The third thing is that I think it makes you generally a more concerned and informed global citizen about a lot of issues that do affect us and many people outside our social spheres that are worth knowing about. And the last thing, quite obviously, is that it is probably one of the few interests that are social in nature that aren't really that impacted by our quarantine in ways that perhaps other games and sports might be. um so the first thing I want to go on to is, what is BP debate? So I'm taking this from the British Parliamentary for Beginners that was written by Tim Squirrel. You can find it online actually. If you Google it, it's quite easy to find. It's a very useful resource that I suggest you guys use. British parliamentary debating is a game that asks four teams of two people to argue about a topic which they have 15 minutes to prepare for in front of one or more judges who will decide who has won. Now, I emphasize game because unlike a lot of other more academic debate formats, you are not able to do research prior, and the speeches are actually quite short. They're 7 minutes. So in sort of the meaningful, strict academic sense, you're not really academically proving much. A lot of it is going to be intuition pumping your arguments to be, or to persuade the judge that it is reasonable to believe the logic of your argument. You're given 15 minutes to prepare. Your speeches are 7 minutes, and you have what's called protected time. So the first minute and the last minute that you're speaking, the other team is not, or other speakers are not allowed to offer points of information. From the first to the 6th minute, teams in the opposing bench will be allowed to raise points of information. So these are short statements that challenge your material, or questions to ask you that may be clarifications, rebuttals to your argument, or it may be about their argument. And these are sort of short statements that may be limited to 15 seconds. So this is the basic flow of the debate. And this is taken from the Practical Guide to Debate. It's a book that a lot of people actually have access to. So you have four teams. You have opening government, opening opposition, closing government, and closing opposition, and two speakers per in each of those teams. I'm not gonna reiterate them. You can read it right there. But what is important to note is, unlike a lot of other formats where there might be just two teams, you have the pro and con side, or the gov, op, affirmative or negative, whatever you want to call it. In BP, there are four teams. And while there might be two teams per side or per bench, so there might be two government teams, these teams are acting independent of each other and are competing with each other in many ways. So it's entirely possible for the opening government to take the fourth, and for closing government to take the first. And so this sort of influences the way you would be debating, depending on your speech. I'll explain later when I go through each of the teams one by one. So this is a general flow. First, it's prime minister, then leader of opposition, deputy prime minister, deputy leader of opposition, member of government, and so on and so forth. So this is very important. How are debates judged? It's not purely a rhetorical competition, so it's not like your public speaking competitions, uh, nor is it a trivia competition. So while information and facts do play a very important role in debate, um, they sort of are secondary in a way to the supporting logic uh, that you'll be using to demonstrate that your facts are likely to be true, right? So they give some degree of plausibility to the claims you're adding, but giving a list of facts, for example, is no substitute for logical persuasion. And the reason why is very simple. Judges are not going to fact check your statements. Debaters are not allowed to research during the competition. Unlike some other formats, you can't sort of just like fact check the data of the other team. So you'll rely on being able to demonstrate that these are reasonably true. And you are evaluated on the basis of truth and relevance insofar as your material is concerned. And judges take a very specific mindset. They have to set aside a lot of their preconceived like notions and biases. So, for example, their political leanings, their religion, their background, their nationality, and take the point of view of what is now called the informed global citizen. So, this is an individual who generally reads the news but doesn't memorize any specific information, doesn't memorize, for example, what all the front pages of all major publications are, but is reasonably informed, right? So, and how you construct your arguments in many debates will be nuanced to this specific aspect. So, for example, there may be certain facts you can rely on, like an informed global citizen knowing, like Donald Trump is the current U.S. president, and other facts they may not be like they may not or you may not assume that they know like prima facie. The next thing I want to talk about is motions. So this one is quite important because there are a lot of technical aspects to this topic. So your motion, the motion is basically the topic that you'll be debating, and there are going to be two sides: the government or the proposition side, and the opposition side, which has to negate that topic. So the format of the motions are normally this house, the rest of the motion, right? Um, so there are generally two types of motions. You have policy motions and analysis motions. So policy motions, uh, and if you look at the example, an example is this house would partition Yemen, come in the form of, generally speaking, this house would, and then an action to complete that sentence. So these debates normally take the perspective of the government, and you will normally be debating on that basis, unless there may be certain exceptions. For example, if it was a motion that the required body to perform that motion is larger than a government, you can assume it's the international community or the United Nations or any other relevant bodies. The under this House would motions, you aren't debating under the perspective of a singular specific government that you set. You're not allowed to do that. You have to debate what or the effects or the merits of this motion if it was applied in the broad spectrum of different governments, and debate on the merits on each of those. The second one is the analysis motion. So an analysis motion is not a motion that prescribes or a specific policy or commands that you defend as a government team the enacting of a specific policy, but it is a motion that asks you to analyze the truth of a statement, right? So for example, this house believes that the US China trade war has done more harm than good. This debate, or to debate this motion, you have to assess whether or not the statement that the US China trade war has done more harm than good. If the pro team or the government team is able to prove that this statement is true, they win the debate. For the op team, obviously, it's the converse, that it is not true. It did not do more harm than good. The third thing to note under motions is you have to familiarize yourself with multiple permutations and the nuances it would imply in terms of the burdens you'd have to take on and how you would frame your arguments under each of these permutations. So these are like, so some of these might be policy, some of these might be analysis, but it's important to know the nuance to each of these like phrases that come out in motions. So one is supports. So when it is a supports motion, like let's say this house supports nationalism, you are debating about the net effect of that which you are like supporting, right? So this house supports nationalism. Is the net impact or net effect of nationalism a like something that is good or something that is bad? For regrets, it is somewhat the opposite, but there are slight differences. So for a regrets motion, so for example, so if we were to use the same motion, we'd have to like change the wording slightly. If we were debating this house regrets the rise of nationalism, let's say that that is an argument with a motion with a reasonable scope. The difference is that it is not that you just have to prove the opposite, that nationalism has more harm than good, but there's a nuance to the time frame, which is since you're regretting it, regret is a retrospective or a word that like sort of connotes like assessment in the past tense. The burden you are taking is to prove that a counterfactual or an alternative reality with X is probably better than what it is today. Okay, so let's say this house regrets nationalism. Your burden as a government team would be to say that had there been a world where nationalism never emerged, it would have been preferable to today. Now, there are important things that you have to note with regrets motions. The first thing that you have to note, or the most important thing, whether you are on the gov side or the op side, is that the gov is not allowed to prop what the alternative counterfactual or the counterfactual would have been. They need to be able to analyze reasonably what that counterfactual would have ended up like being. They can't have a proposal. Therefore, what does this mean? This means like sort of two things, and they're quite like simple. First, if you're a gov team, don't like propose things. It happens quite a lot when I judge debates. There are speakers who would just propose what the world would look like without providing an analysis why that is likely to be true. Conversely, if you're op, don't let your gov teams get away with that. The third thing is the third like general like trendy phrasing of emotion is like this house prefers a world where X. So it is somewhat similar to regrets in that you are comparing a hypothetical counterfactual. So you reimagine a world where X has been present or has been the norm. And this is different from this house would impose X. It is not that you are applying it now and seeing how it would impact social behavior, but you are analyzing what a world would have looked like if that X had always been present or the norm. So one example is this house prefers a world with a like where outrage is a norm in political discourse. A lot of the analysis that one would run when you were debating the usage of outrage in political discourse may not be accessible or may not apply to the same degree if it is worded as this house prefers a world where. So for example, the op team can't just say that if you speak in incredibly like aggressive language, individuals will be put off. The reason being is in a world where that had been the norm, people aren't likely to respond in social disgust, for example. So you need to make sure you nuance to this like sort of operating phrase. The last thing is this house as X. So for example, this house as Donald Trump would end the trade war, for example. If it is this house as X, you have to take X person or institution or group as the house. So you have to assume that their interests are the only interests that are important in the debate. And so this would influence the way that you are nuancing your arguments. So, for example, if you want to make an argument in this House as Donald Trump would cease the trade war with China, that the trade war has had massive impacts on the US economy and the global economy, and it is harmful to the economy and all the individuals who participate in that economy to have this trade war, and therefore we should stop it. The nuancing would be very different if Trump was the assumed House, right? You would probably make an argument to the effect of, because of all these adverse impacts that I talked about, let's just assume that it was meant to be true, right? Assuming all these adverse impacts, it has hurt Donald Trump politically. And since Donald Trump is the House, if we end the trade war, it will help him politically or minimize the political damage the trade war has caused on him. So that's how the nuancing would differ. So you need to be very like sharp with how you're reading motions and the implied burdens for these motions. Next thing I want to talk about is sort of the prep phase. So I think that there obviously is considerable nuance to how you should be prepping depending on your positions. If you're OG compared to if you're CO, it's very, very different. But I think that there are general guidelines that could be true, especially for new debaters or new teams when they're prepping a motion. What is often the tendency for a lot of newer speakers or teams is to instinctively or reflexively just start writing everything they know about the debate down, or writing any possible argument. The first two arguments I could think of, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to make it my PM speech, or I'll make it my members extension, or whatever position you're speaking. You're normally going to figure out what arguments you want to run as soon as possible. That is often not the approach to take, or it's almost always the wrong approach to take if you're a new debater, especially because if you're a newer debater, you're not as used to understanding what the direct burdens of the motion is, what the context of the debate is. And so you will need considerable time to understand this. But more than that, it is very important for you to have a common working understanding of things like the definitions, what the mechanism is, what the context is, who are the most important actors are with your partner. Because very frequently, even if you're throwing phrases at each other and both of you are nodding and assuming you understand it, certain phrases or certain terms can mean very, very different things for two different individuals, or slight differences, and that might lead to inconsistency in your case. So the two most important things you have to do in prep is to have a working understanding of the aspects of the motion and to be on the same page with your partner. But the actual format itself sort of varies. Like, I've been with partners who sort of stick to a list of questions very strictly and rigorously. I've also been with partners who deal with prep a little bit more conversationally. So it depends on you. But if you're newer, I do think that it's probably better to have a list of questions to help you understand the debate. So there are questions that could assist you as mental cues. So for example, why did the ad score set this debate? What is the controversy? What are recent events related to this debate? Who are the most important individuals affected by this debate? If it's a policy debate, what changes from status quo, or what is the delta from status quo? So all these are things that can help you. You can even ask about who are the actors who are impacted, who are the most important actors, and all these sort of questions. So making a working list of questions is sort of quite important to make sure you have an organized case. And generally speaking, you don't want to start writing the arguments down until you understand fully the debate. And as a general rule for prep, prep is always spent for the first speaker. So you aren't really going to be devoting any time in the vast majority of cases thinking about what the second speaker should do in PP, right? Obviously, not the whip, as I'll explain later. It needs to be the member. Especially for opening teams, you need to spend most of that time dedicated to making sure the first speaker's speech is robust. So I'm gonna go on to some like short things about arguments. I know there's an argument lecture, so I'm not going to cover it in so much detail. If it is the case that judges are judging on the basis of the truth and the relevance of your material, it is also the case that your arguments have to mirror this sort of prioritization, right? That arguments have to be both true and important. Okay, uh, and so because of that, you will sort of have the rough structure of arguments or the rough anatomy of the arguments being one, like the title or the label of the argument, which like normally encompasses the thing that you're trying to prove, the outcome that you're trying to prove, or the principle that you're trying to prove. And then you have like the two parts of the body. The first being the mechanism or mechanisms, and the second part being the impact or the multiple impacts. So to put it very simply, these two things are, firstly, why the argument or the claim you're making is true, and secondly, why that claim is important. And you need to get used to this structure, most particularly why the second part, which is impacting your arguments, because in BP debating, judges will not assume things impact or will not assume outcomes that you list down to be important or to be the most important thing in the debate all the time. So you need to make sure that you explain for them and walk them through your logic why this thing is likely to be true, multiple reasons why. Normally one is not sufficient, just to hedge in case or for when you are rebutted, and then explain why that thing is incredibly important. So I just want to have a few things to note in terms of why a specific piece of material is important. You can sort of keep this as a working list. And another good resource to watch is MDG's video on framing. His lecture on framing also helps with the impacting portion of your argument. So you normally want to look at things like, is it important in terms of the intensity of its impact, or the scale, which is the amount of individuals impacted, or the inherency of the impact, or the probability of the impact vis-a-vis other impacts in the debate. So these are all ways in which you can prove that your argument is the most important, or important in the round, or important enough for the judge to weigh in the debate. So these are the two broad aspects. I don't want to cover it too much. It's going to be tackled by another speaker. Next thing is rebuttals. So if it is true that in arguing, you have two equally important things, you have your mechanism, or your how does X thing happen, or why that thing is true, and you have the impact, which is why that thing is important, it is important for you to attack or rebut both of these things, right? So there are a number of ways you can sort of write like a working list, because I think rebutting might be quite difficult for you to do, or difficult for you to get the hang of, especially with the time pressure in BP when you're new. So I mean, you can have a working list of questions about pieces of material. So are the mechanisms sound, or have they been properly proven? Is there a way I can attack any of these mechanisms? Do any of these mechanisms contradict? Do any of these arguments contradict with other arguments? Is this argument comparative? Or another way of saying it is this argument exclusive, or does this also apply to our side? And then you can have, or you should also build the habit of figuring out how to mitigate the argument. And so mitigation generally does not directly disprove the argument, but it can diminish the impact of an argument, either by proving that is not entirely exclusive, or that is uncomparative. You're able to diminish the overall weight of the argument in the eyes of the judges. But lastly, it is also important for you to rebut the impacting portion of arguments. Because if an argument is unimportant, regardless of how true that argument is, it's not really going to carry much weight in the eyes of a judge. So the first thing I want to go to is opening government. So opening government, you have two speakers. You have the prime minister and the deputy prime minister. So the prime minister is the first person to speak in the round, and the deputy prime minister is the only person in the OG team who is able to rebut another person or directly engage with another person, which is the leader of opposition. Given this, like, the role of the prime minister is to sort of contextualize the debate, explain what the context of the debate is, define the terms that may be like variously interpreted to make sure you have a working understanding that all teams can use for this debate to take place, and then launch argumentation in support of the motion, generally speaking. The deputy prime minister's role is to, one, rebuild material or support the material of the prime minister, which is to say, defend that material from attacks that the leader of opposition has made. The second thing they need to do is they need to engage with the material of the leader of opposition. And the last thing they need to do is, although it is not strictly necessary, they need to provide, or they would provide, new argumentation or new material. So in the prep phase of the debate, really all you are doing is making sure you have a robust prime minister speech where you're able to pack in arguments that are very, very compelling, or the most important arguments on the gov side into the prime minister's speech. None of prep actually is going to the deputy prime minister's speech. All of it is going to is going to be directed, or all your resources are going to be spent writing that prime minister's speech. So the DPM is sort of like assisting the prime minister in making that speech. In terms of the in-round like strategy, it is almost always a very good idea to make sure that the prime minister, or to pack in as much material as possible in the prime minister's speech, to make sure that the deputy prime minister has like freed up time to be able to pivot strategically if it is necessary, to be able to respond to the leader of opposition, which is the most important thing actually, because if the deputy prime minister does not respond or does not engage adequately for with the opening opposition, it's very easy to accuse the opening government team of just not being very engaging at all, given that they only have like one opportunity to respond. So a lot of the, like, if you're a DPM and you don't really have stuff like dedicated material entering that round, that's not a bad thing. Sometimes that's actually a good thing. So you have like freed up time to respond to material. It is also very important that you rebuild material. So by the time the first exchange, or the like PM and LO are done speaking, the material that the prime minister like originally run, and how the judge values that material, like those two things are not going to be the same, because the LO will have already responded to that, like to that piece of material. So like you need to make sure that you respond to those like attacks and rebuild the material and support that material. So like to summarize, like PM set up the debate, run material about why the proposal or the motion should stand. The DPM can run new material, but needs to respond and needs to defend the material of the prime minister. So opening opposition is like somewhat symmetrical in that the LO should highlight what the case of the, or the stance of the op bench as a whole is, and they need to run material that opposes the motion. But it is quite different in that you have to be somewhat more flexible as a leader of opposition speaker. The reason being that you as a leader of opposition have the ability to challenge the definition or the terms that the PM set for the debate or accept it. So like if you accept them, you don't you don't have to obviously verbalize I accept the terms, right? You just debate as is. But you have to be very explicit for when you are like challenging the definition if it is necessary. It is almost never like necessary. It's very rare. And this should only be done when the other team is defining the motion to avoid what the intended debate is, or if the definition cannot reasonably be interpreted from the words of the motion. Otherwise, the LO should be responding to the like prime minister, responding to their context or to their frame. If the LO believes that or if you believe that the frame is or the context is inaccurate, to counter frame, and then to rebut the prime minister and then run arguments for the opposition side. The DLO's speech is actually quite symmetrical to the DPM. The only difference being that person has two people to respond to as opposed to only one. So they need to respond to the material of the DPM and the PM. They need to defend the material of the LO and give new pieces of analysis or new material. Now, closing government. Now, there are two speakers in the closing government. You have the member of government, then you have the government whip. So firstly, what is a member? Like on both sides, you'll sort of have the same role, member of government, member of opposition. The role of the member is to provide what is called an extension. Now, what an extension is novel, relevant, like material in the debate. So this can be in the form of new responses, a new demonstration for an argument, a new impact for an argument, a new mechanism for an argument. So like all of these things can be extensions. Now, what is sort of like ideal as an extension depends on the motion. So like lots of motions might have lots of potential ways you can extend an emotion because it's quite like a deep motion. Other motions will have very limited sets of interests. So it might be more valuable for you to just run on extension on or an extension in the form of a better mechanism, for example. So it's really case to case. But generally, you want to get into the practice of being able to come up with novel, independent arguments that are still relevant to the debate. So that is the goal of the member of government, symmetrically the member of opposition. Now, the whip is quite unique as a position in BP debate. So the whip is the only speaker in the debate who cannot introduce new material. Now, new material, like in terms of insofar as that rule is concerned, is basically new argumentation. They're allowed to support the argumentation of the member, but they're not allowed to give like completely new argumentation. So if they contextualize the argument, that's fine. If they clarify the mechanism of that argument, that's fine. But they cannot, for example, transform the way that argument was run. So for example, if your member does not provide a mechanism for your argument, you cannot provide a mechanism which transforms how that argument is valued. But the general goal of the extension speaker, what you're traditionally told when you're new is that the not extension speaker, sorry, the whip speaker, is that you are a summary speaker, that you summarize the debate. I don't think you are necessarily a summary speaker, or not strictly speaking at least. I think more of what you are is you are basically strategic commentary on the round. And a lot of this will require you explaining why, strategically speaking, your member had the edge in the debate. So your primary objective is to prove why the material of the member was winning material in the debate. And there are many ways you can structure your whip speech. You can do it based on themes or issues in the debate, general impacts or different types of impacts in the debate, or you can even do issues based on each individual team. So have an issue on the OG, why you beat OG, why you beat OO, and why you beat CO as an example. It's quite a simple structure. What is unique or what is different, like with regard to CG, is the government whip needs to respond or needs to make sure they have they spend adequate time responding to the member of opposition's extension, because no other speaker can respond um, to that speaker, and if they're left unresponded to, it can become very strategically detrimental to CG. CO, like sort of symmetrical. You have a member of opposition and you have the opposition whip. The opposition whip does have like a little bit more control over the round than the government whip does, because they're speaking last, but it's sort of similar in that regard, like that they are strategic commentary in the round and comparing their material with the rest of the material in the round, explaining why their material is the most important. So those are the basics of debate insofar as like BP debate is concerned. So some random like helpful things. So the first thing is like there's a lot of like resource material out there for debate. So the biggest thing is just there are a lot of rounds that are recorded, like any format, Asians format, WSTC format. They're all online. You can look them up on YouTube and watch all sorts of different rounds. You can take notes on them, write down arguments you think are very compelling or you might be able to use. And you're able to learn from that. Just from watching other very good debaters speak, you're able to learn a lot. And there are a lot of like debate education focused like materials, like the European Debate Training Platform, the UDC Prep Platform for 2020, which is found in the Astana Debate Union YouTube channel. There's the source material that I cited earlier, the British Parliamentary for Beginners by Tim Squirrel. If you Google it, you can find it. The Korea WDC training program. So there's a lot of material out there. My advice is if you were taking notes on rounds and you plan on using this material in your speeches, a lot of the advice I gave you earlier about understanding the burdens of the motion become way more important to make sure that you're nuancing and not just copying and pasting an argument to a motion that may not necessarily have the same nuances. But there's a lot of resource material out there for you to use in order for you to get better. Like you don't necessarily need a coach, although coach would be very helpful. You don't even necessarily need to do that many rounds, although rounds would obviously be very helpful. There's a lot of resource material out there. The last thing is sort of just information. So information is very important in debate. It gives you a working understanding of the context of lots of different motions. It also just gives you many ideas and perspectives of other like groups that you'll be debating about, especially because a lot of motions require you to predict the responses or behaviors of certain groups. So there are certain resource materials that I think are very helpful, or certain like sources of information that are very helpful for you to have. Something like a CIA fact book or an almanac, or something that gives you country profiles, demographics, political information, economic information on different countries would be very helpful. Big like in the event that you are debating about an issue that you don't, or an area or a country that you don't know much about. Insofar as IR is concerned, like I like reading from Foreign Affairs. I think that they have very like, I mean, they're quite long if you're not used to reading the news, but I mean, I like that's my preferred source of news. Economist, but like I put an asterisk there because like it's not normally my first source of information. And I don't think it analyzes the issues like very well. But the reason why I would prescribe it is I think it's a lot easier to read than Foreign Affairs, especially if you're newer to reading about like international relations or like any sort of news. And like a lot of other debaters also use it, so it might be important to know what like the information meta is like in the debate community. And then you have websites like aeon.co that have like a lot of philosophy articles, or just expose you to different types of ideas that might be useful for debate. Then you have things like the BBC timelines, which show you like a timeline of events, relevant dates, all things that are just important for you to be able to like have some credibility when you're debating about like certain events. Like if you can refer to the specific date that something happened or the names of certain like agreements, etc. Now, another thing is reading from a wide set of news outlets. So, like you have a lot of the more liberal ones, like Salon is extremely liberal, Fox is extremely liberal, New York Times is quite liberal, The Atlantic and CNN like sort of like center left, and then you have the Wall Street Journal, Fox, the Daily Wire, which are like quite conservative, and also might be useful to you, for you to read like maybe even like pro-China publications like the South China Morning Post. And the reason why this is important is because when you're debating about like a policy or a specific value and how it impacts many different individuals, um, it is very useful to understand what the perspective is of individuals you may not necessarily agree with. So it's very important, for example, to understand what conservatives think of universal basic income or how conservatives view things like um, socialized healthcare, to understand what their perspective is, especially when you're debating like topics related to this. It's very important to understand what the pro-China perspective on specific major events are for you to understand this. And I think like when you are reading, for example, more conservative news or even like pro-China news, like any news you read, you have to read it very judiciously and you have to read it understanding the context in which it is written, that these writers are coming from a specific perspective, a specific like ideological tilt or leaning. But in any case, it is a very good thing to have a very like diverse media diet or news like diet, because a lot of times, and even in some like specific instances, motions will call for you to debate in a specific perspective, even like a conservative perspective, even though the vast majority of debaters like might lean towards the left or the center left. So it's very important for you to be exposed to many different viewpoints in order for you to have like a better understanding on specific issues. So that so far as information like is concerned. So I'm just gonna say like a bit more stuff about like training and improving. One, I think it's just generally very helpful when you're newer to get a lot of rounds in and speeches in to make sure you're comfortable speaking in front of a crowd or speaking for 7 minutes, and being able to organize your thoughts while you're speaking and all that like sort of stuff. It's also very important for you to be reading and understanding a lot of information that is commonly accessed in debating things. So, for example, it's very important for you to have a working understanding of a lot of the classic geopolitical events. So things like the like Arab-Israel conflict. It's also very important for you to have an understanding of relevant events with regards to social justice. So you might want to have an understanding of multiple different movements like the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, the suffragettes, like all of these different like there are multiple bodies of information that you will need to have a decent understanding of for you to be able to be like good or like decent in debate. So I think that training is very important and speaking constantly is very important, but having access to information and constantly reading is just as important, and it's an aspect of debate that is often overlooked by newer debaters. So I think that that's a specific thing that I want to emphasize for newer debaters, that the easiest way to get better is to read more. Um, Besides that, I don't really have much to add. Thanks for listening.